Thanks very much. And hello, everyone. Nice to see you all and have the opportunity to talk through some advocacy work that we have been working on for the past few years. My name's Laura Boileau. I work for Article 36. We're a UK-based organisation, but in that role, I also coordinate the International Network on Explosive Weapons, INEW, which is a global civil society partnership of organisations that set up around 12 years ago to address the human harm and suffering from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. So I'm going to talk specifically about the process of work that we have been working on over the last few years through INEW, through the Civil Society Coalition, and specifically the process, this political process towards the negotiation of a new international agreement, which is the political declaration on strengthening the protection of civilians from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. And that's not even the full title. It has an even longer title as well, if you want to look that up. But before jumping straight into perhaps talking through some of the dynamics and lessons around that process, I might just introduce a little bit the issue that we're working on. So like I said, this is an issue that we started working on about 12 years ago. And our network formed and set up because of our concern around the human suffering and devastation from the use of explosive weapons in towns and cities and other populated areas. So we're talking about bombing and shelling. And these are military-grade weapons that are used in these situations that we're concerned about: aircraft bombs, rockets, missiles, artillery, that function by projecting blast and fragmentation across an area. And so, as you know and can imagine, these are very harmful weapons when used in populated areas and around people, that causes a lot of deaths and injuries and trauma. But also does a lot of damage to buildings and other critical civilian infrastructure, often located in towns and cities. So destroys schools, hospitals, water pipelines, electricity networks, which impacts the provision of essential services, and often people located far outside of the area of attack. So from our perspective, highly inappropriate for use in populated areas and not accepted, I would say, as weapons in policing. These tend to be weapons used specifically in military operations. So the aims of our advocacy work were to build up recognition of this problem as a global humanitarian issue and a pattern of harm that can be seen and has been experienced in a range of different contexts and countries. So we've seen it in Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Gaza, Ukraine, Sudan, Ethiopia, to name just a few examples. And I think also to challenge the notion that this is acceptable practice. And we really drew attention to the combination of the weapons being very problematic, and also in this specific context of use. So in towns and cities, pushing for greater restraint, obviously, in that area and better understanding. And I think pushing back on the notion that this practice was just an inevitable consequence of warfare. And we wanted to build up support for change, so normative change. We wanted to see new standards being developed and to be done through changes in policy and practice. And I think most crucially, military policy and practice. And we worked to do this through the development of a political declaration. We thought that international framework and would be a good place to, I guess, house a series of commitments that would drive forward policy change in the area of military policy and practice, but also other areas that can better assist affected communities, victim assistance, data collection, for example. So this process started up 3.5 years ago, and it was concluded, at least the phase that I'm going to talk about, the text of the negotiation was concluded last year at a meeting in Geneva, and the text was then open up for states to sign on to later in the year. So we saw 83 countries sign on to the political declaration in Dublin at a meeting in November last year. So a very good outcome in terms of numbers. I think that surpassed our expectations. And an agreement that I think is something we've worked on for a long time and certainly consider a key milestone and success, but also starting off a more important process of work around its implementation. So I'm going to look a bit at some of the challenges and dilemmas that we faced when negotiating the declaration. And I think, first of all, a big challenge was getting this issue onto the agenda, onto the political agenda. In the beginning, it was refuted by a lot of states, and I think particularly the military active states. And how this was refuted changed a bit over time. I think in the beginning, in the early days of our advocacy, there was outright rejection that this was an issue of concern, to the point where a lot of states would even refuse to say the words explosive weapons in populated areas, and I think actively went out of their way to avoid talking about the issue. We did a lot of work gathering data and documenting the evidence to counter this. One of the main data gathering efforts that we undertook found that when explosive weapons are used in populated areas, 90% of the victims are civilians. So we use this data and this research as evidence to put it on the table and make states talk about it and respond to it. We work very closely with a lot of partners, so the ICRC and the UN in particular. And I think a key kind of milestone for us was when the UN Secretary General picked this issue up, and it was put in the annual reports on the protection of civilians in armed conflict. So this became a top policy recommendation in these reports and in the forum around discussing the protection of civilians. So a lot of our advocacy work then was encouraging states to speak to this and respond to the report. I think another challenge was misrepresentation of what we were calling for. A lot of us had been involved and recently working on international treaties that ban certain types of explosive weapons, particularly cluster munitions, but before that, anti-personnel landmines. And perhaps in the early days, there was some misunderstanding about what we were seeking to achieve, but I think there was also some purposeful misrepresentation that we were out to ban all types of explosive weapons. And this was a real concern by a number of states, this being that these are a very broad category of weapons and the sorts of weapons that are used most commonly in military operations today. It was also a bit of a challenge, I think, getting the political process underway. So we needed leadership by a state or group of states. And we needed a forum or a way of negotiating this instrument. So a political process of sorts, often, in the form of a series of different meetings. In the early days, we had Austria taking the lead, and they put together a core group that met regularly in Geneva. And this was a core group that was based on regional diversity. So the idea that we would be able to have some champions in different world regions, that would be able to perhaps work to get their states within their regions on board this process. But I think one of the main stumbling blocks we had at that point in time was lack of policy coherence within the group. And I think particularly a main question was, how ambitious did we want this political declaration to be? Some members of the group wanted it to just restate that international humanitarian law was applicable, and others wanted it to be more ambitious, including us, where it would have actual commitments in it that would bring about changes to policy and practices and kind of new requirements. We muddled through that for a few years, I think, where it's useful to bring this issue on the agenda. But a turning point for us was when Ireland announced that it would lead a process in Geneva to develop a political declaration. And so the leadership of Ireland, supported by Austria and other states, laid out a clear programme of work through a series of meetings in Geneva. And that was very helpful for setting the direction. In the process of this, they lost the backing of a core group of states, but it did allow them to move forwards without having a group that was responsible for signing off on documents or purpose of meetings in the way that we were struggling a bit with before that. When the negotiations began, and these were all based in Geneva, it was a process where states that wanted to take part in it opted in. And I think in some ways this was very helpful, because it avoided a situation where you had states that were unwilling participants in it. There was no vetoes like we were hearing about earlier, and I think other forums suffer from, where decisions are blocked and you end up with the lowest common denominator outcome. But through this process, it was opt-in. So in large part, it was also up to us, I think, to mobilize a good group of states that were able to take part in it. We found, and I think perhaps in the early days this was a bit surprising to us, that even the states that were opposed to the development of the political declaration decided to join in the negotiations. That was quite challenging, and I think there was quite a lot of discussion around what the focus should be. We and others were pushing very much for a focus that was directly on the issue of explosive weapons in populated areas. Other states wanted to water down the focus of negotiations and the text of the declaration and to have it more broadly on urban warfare. We managed to move past that, and it did have this sharp focus that we wanted on a specific problem, which was important because it set up, I think, the responses that we wanted to see in the text that addressed specifically tackling harm from bombing and shelling in populated areas. And then we saw also, and I think particularly from a lot of the militarily active states, trying to divert focus onto other issues. So this would range from, this isn't a problem of responsible actors like this is a problem of non-state armed groups using these weapons, or it's a problem of rogue states using these weapons in ways that violate the law, directly targeting civilians. And again, I think our data and research showing that we had evidence of civilian harm from a range of different states and parties to conflict, including from some of these states that were self-declared responsible states, was quite helpful in showing that this was a widespread pattern of harm that we were working to address and extended beyond just so-called violations, instances where there were violations of the law. I think there were also some practical issues and dynamics that were quite challenging. We, after kind of perhaps wondering whether a lot of the militarily active states would take part because they were opposed to the issue, they tended to dominate discussions. And I think we found that whilst these meetings were taking place in Geneva, it was these states that had the most resources, particularly in person time, to be able to send representatives to the negotiations. And conversely, we struggled to mobilize states from all over the world and have good regional diversity in it, and have states that were from countries that were affected by armed violence take place in the negotiations. And I think particularly from regions like Africa. So we tried to get around this by organising some regional conferences and work very closely with champion states in that region to reach out to engage those countries. And I think that's a dynamic that we struggled with throughout the process and still do now to a certain extent. The negotiations were also taking place during a pandemic. So whilst this is a bit of an anomaly at this point in time, it did impact us. And in particular, it impacted our ability to bring representatives from work from other parts of the world, and particularly from conflict affected regions. And that's been very helpful, I think, in other processes to really bring voices of people with lived experiences to talk about the issue to the conferences themselves. But this was really very challenging and not possible for the Explosive Weapons Declaration. So we had to find other creative ways of doing that, often through virtual engagement. Another challenge was that the invasion of Ukraine happened just as we were getting to the culmination of the political declaration process. So this brought the issue to the fore. And in some ways, this was very helpful because it was a clear illustration of the problem that we were talking about. People were seeing it on their TV screens and hearing about it on a day-to-day basis. But it also risked politicizing the issue very much. We try to remind states and others that this is a pattern of harm we've seen in lots of different countries around the world. It wasn't just a situation in Ukraine that this was a response to, and it wasn't an instrument that was being developed in response to this. So it wasn't a so-called anti-West or a Western kind of anti-Russian initiative, which was, I think, a concern particularly by states in Africa. We had to make compromises too, and I think this is really important because we had to decide which compromises we wanted to make. And I think we also had to understand as a collective network that compromises are inevitable in these sorts of processes. There was going to be something that we had to give away. And it's, I think, quite hard to plan for. It's a moving dynamic constantly. So it's a little bit hard in advance to work out where your red lines might be. It involves lots of different conversations with different partners and different actors. But I say at the end of the day, the main compromises really lay in response to the text and what it says, what it doesn't say. Fundamentally, I think the most contentious part of the negotiation was around restrictions on use of explosive weapons. This was the main kind of crux of what we wanted the political declaration to do, to place clear limits on use. And there was a lot of pushback to it. So the commitment on this is not as clear and it's not as strict as we would want to see. We wanted something that clearly said that states shouldn't be using explosive weapons that have wide area effects in populated areas. And in the end, we've got a commitment that calls on those that have signed on to the declaration to develop national policies to avoid civilian harm by restricting or refraining from use. So we see this as deferring some of those decisions to the national level about when they don't use or when they perhaps limit their use instead. We felt as a group it didn't undermine it because it's still calling very much for limitations on use. And I think we need to be doing advocacy at the national level now to make sure that the national level policies interpret this in the strongest possible way. There were other compromises. I won't go into too much detail about these. I think they weren't so significant in the end, but a lot of it was like certain language in the text in operative commitments. So around wide area effects, this was a line that we very much wanted in there because I think it reflected the problem we were concerned about. But some of the solutions that we came to with Ireland were that some of this language was reflected in the preamble, particularly on reverberating effects, so the kind of indirect impacts of conflict, but it hasn't been taken into the operative commitments. In terms of how we made decisions around compromises, obviously, we wanted to make sure it didn't undermine any of the things that we were calling for, and we didn't feel like the text did in the end. We looked at our early call to action that we had as a civil society network, and we felt that the text covered all of the areas that we wanted it to address. And we felt that it added value. A particular concern, I think, in the earlier days was that it needs to do more than just reiterate what international humanitarian law says. So we didn't make too many threats, I don't think, throughout the process. But we did say, if this text doesn't have commitments that add value, then, this is at the point where we will withdraw support for it. But I'm pleased to say it didn't get to that point. So just briefly in closing, I think this is a very positive example, the political declaration, a good development and outcome in the area of protection and of multilateralism working, and I think developed in a very challenging time with quite extensive use of explosive weapons and conflict in the world. We see it very much as a long-term initiative. It's a framework, it's a tool for bringing about change. It covers quite a broad area of issues, and it is quite a huge thing that we're trying to change. I think it concerns about how wars are fought and this movement away from using explosive force in towns and cities. So I think from that perspective, we can't expect to see change tomorrow. We need to be in it for the long haul. We need to keep chipping away at change and thinking about what measures of success we want to see along the way. And then last of all, I think really important here is engaging different partners, and particularly militaries, armed actors. We need to be building dialogue for change with them and with other field-based agencies, and making sure that we put on the table through these future declaration meetings the different perspectives that are there and the different realities. I think there's inherently this tension between the military restraint that we want to see and the humanitarian concerns. So being able to create space and bring different actors together to talk about it is going to be hopefully a very key outcome through this process of work. But I would say and I think what I tried to push for as the coordinator of the network was not to get too hung up on numbers. And obviously, it's good to have a good group of states signing on to the agreement, and certainly you need at least some signing on to it. We tried to focus on getting a range of different perspectives and a mix of different states to make it regionally diverse. I think that was more important than numbers to us. We were really surprised with the number of 83 states. I mean, this far exceeded our expectations. Our internal target was about 50. And actually, we had more states sign on that were involved in the process. And I think in part that this was a result of the Ukraine conflict kicking off. And in part, it was Ireland doing really excellent advocacy as well in bilateral outreach to states. But I think one good example was the Safe Schools Declaration, which we also worked on, not as I knew, but in another capacity, and where we've got a lot of similarities, I think, in experiences. And they had 37, I think, states sign on to the Safe Schools Declaration in the beginning. And that worked really well. There was a lot of countries that were quite challenging in the process, and they almost as a group decided not to sign on to it. But the most important thing, I think, is setting the bar high in terms of having good text, and then you can work to bring on these states later on, rather than they kind of fit together, don't they? Where if you weaken the text to bring a bigger group of states on, that's usually like the way it plays out. So I think not being too focused on how many join in the beginning. And I think we've seen that in other situations as well with other treaties, the Convention on Cluster Munitions, Mine Ban Treaty, set the standard high, bring in other states over time. And then in terms of focus, similarly, I think it's going to be really important for this declaration and for others to set a good culture of implementation at the beginning. And so that is our focus more than it is bringing even more countries on board it. That there's an expectation that upon signing on to this agreement that you need to make changes, and to try and work with, I think, some key countries to make sure that there are very progressive, positive examples of implementation across different areas. So military policy and practice being one key thing. So I think that is where we're going to focus our main resources. Not to say we won't do outreach. I think within the region of Africa, we've identified that as a priority. On your second question and point around links to other issues and other areas, I mean, one thing I'd say is if you look at the text of the political declaration, in the preamble in particular, it does make the link between a range of different other issues. For example, displacement and how bombing and shelling leads to displacement, around psychological trauma, around the specific impact on children, around gender differences. So what I would quite like to see from future work is that this issue of explosive weapons is picked up in other forums and the linkages being made. But I think also there's a balance there as well, where there needs to be enough specificity on this particular issue for it to get traction within certain forums as well. So yeah, I'll leave it there. We do this in a couple of different ways. One is we monitor and we track what states are saying about the issue. So we do this through statements that they're issuing in different forums, and a lot of our advocacy is encouraging states to speak up on it and to talk about their implementation of it. So I guess it was a bit of a question. It is a question for us. Are we going to focus our efforts on tracking harm to civilians and seeing whether that changes, whether deaths and injuries change from explosive weapons? And I think we thought this was quite a tricky way of approaching it. Instead, I think, we will continue to do that, but in terms of measuring our own successes and the impact of the declaration, we will be monitoring states' implementation of it. So how many states are putting in place national policies and measures to implement it? So changes in national policies like military rules of engagement or doctrine on this issue. How many are establishing mechanisms to track data, or like to gather data on explosive weapon use and the impacts of explosive weapon use, particularly the users of weapons? How many have got national focal points there on for victim assistance of explosive weapons in those countries? So I think looking at it in terms of policy change and practical changes driven by the key commitments in the political declaration. We will also gather data on attacks using explosive weapons in populated areas so that we can see real life impacts and seeing whether attacks have gone down. And again, this is something that the Safe Schools community have done a lot around that declaration, and have fortunately been able to track that since the Safe Schools declaration came about and states have signed onto it, they have seen a decrease in attacks on schools and educational facilities, and particularly by those states that have signed on to the political declaration.